So we are moving on to our fourth and final workshop of the day, which will be delivered by Dr. Jannett Morgan from JM Learning and Skills. Dr. Morgan is the Associate Programme Director for Diversifying Leadership, which is the Advanced HE programme from Global Majority Early Career Academic and Professional Services employees, which to date has served participants from over 50 institutions. Jannett has over 20 years' experience of supporting students with hidden disabilities such as dyslexia and dyspraxia. And Jannett has delivered keynotes and inclusive development sessions at several universities. She's also an accredited neurodiversity specialist workplace coach and works strategically with employers and sector bodies, including the Association of Dyslexia Specialists in Higher Education and the British Dyslexia Association. Dr. Jannett, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and experience with us. Over to you.
Thanks, Marcia. I'm delighted to be here, but I think you've just promoted me. I think the only Dr. Morgan in the house is Winston. It's not me, so I'm not a doctor, but that's the quickest way to get myself a PhD. So I'm loving that. I'm going to claim it. But, you know, if anybody else says that I said that, then, you know, obviously, you know, I've done the disclaimer. So look, thank you so much. Goodness me, how do I follow everything that has gone on before me? I can't. But I hope that, you know, what I'm going to say is really going to consolidate, I guess, some of the stuff that you heard earlier on. So let me just share my slides, not that many, and pray to the team's gods that they behave. So hopefully you can see this. If someone can just let me know.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great, excellent. So yeah, I just want to congratulate you, Bernadine and Heidi and Shireen and the team for a fabulous job that you've done today. And let me just say, how is it possible that someone who can not only has the potential to start a revolution actually does it? How is it possible that person has to wait for 10 years to get themselves a role as a lecturer? That kind of speaks to, I think, what I'm going to be talking to you about for the next few minutes. And I guess the other disclaimer that I've got to make is I'm adding to the conspiracy theory that there is a bias, perhaps conscious or unconscious, for Jamaican contributors today. So I'll let other people sort that out, but I've got to hold my hands up and say, yes, there's another Jamaican in the house today. It's no bad thing, though, and it's planting. So look, the last time I spoke at the conference was 2018, and again, it was an honour to be there. And I remember being struck by the number of people in the audience. It was face to face, which was great. I'm really excited that next year we'll be back face to face again. But I was really struck by the number of people in the audience who stood up and spoke about the first time that there was a lecturer or, you know, on a rare occasion, a professor who looked like them. And I think it was described earlier, that joy at seeing someone in that role of what they saw as leadership was palpable. You could see that. And, you know, here we are again talking about a similar sort of thing. And that's quite scary because there's still plenty of work to do, we know. So Marcia mentioned diversifying leadership, and Lorraine mentioned it too. Thanks, Lorraine. And it's that program that's actually brought me into contact with so many of the speakers that you've heard today. And, you know, were it not for networking, I wouldn't have been able to get, you know, Fumi and Marcia to come in and deliver some leadership insights and give so generously of their time and energy. So I want to thank you for that as well. And today it's now over 60 institutions, 260 academic and professional services staff. So a large number of early career researchers. And as someone who's not an academic, I'm therefore not bringing that perspective into what I'm talking about today, but I certainly have some insight, having spent so much time with early career researchers and the work that I do around, I guess what is being called now anti-racism, but, you know, to me is very much rooted in activism. So I love your idea about setting up our own funding bodies. I think that's a great idea, and I'd love to be a part of that conversation as well, if I can push myself in there. And the other person that I have to acknowledge is, of course, Annette, who is another colleague that I met through Diversify Leadership, and hugely value her insights and her friendship. But Prof. Goss, and, you know, those of you who didn't really know Gus before he spoke today, didn't know that he was going to bring the fire. But those of us that know him know he will, and he takes no prisoners. So I'm sitting up very straight in my chair now, because I know he's probably going to pull me up on some things that I might say. And I have certainly, in some of the work that I've done, drunk the EDI Kool-Aid in the furtherance of what I see as activism. And I think that the complexity that Fumi was talking about speaks to, you know, many of us kind of getting our toe, I think you said, Fumi, jamming our toe in that door so that we can effect some kind of change. So I'll say a bit more about that as I carry on. And I guess this question has been answered in terms of whether or not you still need to be doing a conference about this. You know, all of the talks that you've had, the input, and even the chat demonstrates just how much spaces like this are needed. And I know, because I've worked in academia under the sort of professional services side, that it can be a wonderful place and it can offer a really rewarding and fulfilling career. That said, you know, if we just listen to some of the conversation that we've had this afternoon, we've heard people talk about brutal toxicity, microaggressions. You know, that doesn't sound like a space that is too healthy, when we have to say, right, we've all got to look after ourselves and look after our well-being. And in a way, that's one of the reasons that I stepped out of higher education and worked for myself. One, because I wanted to, that's where my leadership journey took me. But also, for me, I was trying to kind of wrestle with this. How can I be in this space that is treating people so badly, so brutally? It's so toxic. It doesn't make sense to me that I'm going to thrive in a space like that. I can do my best work for higher education outside of higher education. That's my story. But I also recognize that if we are going to be in this space, we need to be as healthy and as happy and as enriched and nourished, I think you said, Lorraine, as we can possibly be. And that means that we need a game plan. And when I say this, I am not absolving institutions from what it is that they need to do. And Gus has spelt that out far more eloquently than I could ever do in terms of dismantling some of the structural barriers. But also, you know, what I'm very interested in is how we can agentically move forward and find that leadership route, whatever it looks like for any of you, whether that is that lecturer role, a senior lecturer role, professorship, or indeed moving out of the sector if that's for you. How do you do that in a way that serves you and serves your communities? So this quote is not in here because I knew Gus was going to be speaking. It's something that I use quite a lot, Gus. So you may recognise this from your 2006 book, Taking a Stand. But it really helped me to kind of make sense of what was going on, not just in higher education, but pretty much in all of our institutions. So as the child of Jamaicans who came to this country in the 60s, who came to what they thought was the mother country, and for those of us of a certain vintage, you'll understand what I say when I say it turned out to be the mummy dearest country for many of them, that was quite a shock. And people had to kind of spin on a dime and finding new strategies to survive. So this lived experience that, you know, Gus, I think you're referring to here, has enabled us to hold the mirror up to many of our institutions in a way that they find uncomfortable. And at the same time, we have had to find those strategies to navigate these spaces, as you say, in order to survive, but also to send out a lesson about what humanity looks like. I guess the thing for me as someone who was born in this country that was wrestling and I've continued to wrestle with is survival is supposed to be a temporary state. You know, what happens when that becomes a permanent state? What happens to us when we are in a permanent state of survival? And that really, for me, is then it becomes this leadership endeavour that we need to think about as part of our talk today. So many of us got the memo that if we work really, 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 really hard, then all of the spoils are going to come. And Nirvana is getting into higher education, especially those red brick universities. Yeah, we all got that memo. The spoils would come. But it didn't quite turn out like that. And again, the discussion today and all of the commentary in the chat is kind of what I call the how come conversation. Well, how come if I completed the grant application and I ticked all of the boxes, how come I still got rejected? Nobody can explain that to me. How come my colleague, my white colleague, though, they've sailed through, or they seem to have sailed through? How come has that happened? How come nobody comes and connects with me and I don't get a sponsor or a mentor, or I've got to work really hard to do that? So there's all these things that are going on that, you know, contribute to some of the well-being challenges that we have been hearing about and we've been sharing with each other. So what's all that got to do with leadership? So for me, what we are grappling with, this complexity that Fumi talked about, and also this wicked problem of structural racism, it involves all of these things. You know, what are the knowledge and the skills that I need to be able to leverage? How does that reconcile itself with the predominant leadership narratives that we have, which are mainly individualistic, mainly Eurocentric, and seem to privilege, you know, mainly white males, also white females as well? How do I wrestle with that? What is this sort of politics stuff? I don't want to do politics. I don't like the Machiavellian kind of edge to that. What are these political skills that I need? And what's that got to do with my identity and what I bring to the table and my values? All of these things are kind of bubbling away when we're thinking about leadership. And as I say, long before I did any kind of training in what we call leadership and management development, what I realized is that leadership was all around me. It was around me in my families. It was around me in my community. It was around me in the chores that I had to do as a child. It was around me in terms of the captaincies that I had when I was at school. It was around me in terms of the supplementary schools that I went to when I was young. I saw leadership in all sorts of forms, and I didn't find my way into a university until I was in my 20s and had a child. So my leadership had taken place long before I found myself in that space. And what I needed to do was kind of connect myself to that and look at how I could be agentic and actually be the leader that I wanted to do. Now, for me, many of those lessons that I learned didn't come in the form of a textbook. As I said, it wasn't, you know, here is your leadership manual, Jannett. It was in the form of the stories that I received from the people in my community. And one form of those stories was in the proverbs that I heard. And I hold those things really dear. And what I should say is that, because there was the conversation about Shakespeare earlier, wasn't there? And what I realised is my first act of resistance was to make a deliberate decision not to like Shakespeare. Nothing against Shakespeare, but my issue was that nobody could have explained to me why this person was so brilliant, but other people that I knew to be brilliant weren't brilliant and celebrated. So I had a problem with this Shakespeare thing. And again, you were talking about that with Akala. And at the same time, I was thinking, again, from my own background and culture, about someone called Miss Lou. The Jamaicans in the house will know. Miss Lou is Louise Bennett, one of the national heroes of Jamaica, who was a poet, a writer, a journalist, an author on Jamaican folklore. And many of her poems have spoken to the sort of power of the language and the life in Jamaica. And all of these stories and these proverbs for me, what I didn't realize at the time, because I didn't understand a lot of them at the time, is that my family and my community were teaching me lessons of leadership. So what I thought we would do in this workshop is I'm going to invite you to think about the people in your community, your background, whatever that background is. And I'm going to share sort of just 3 proverbs with you and talk about them in the context of leadership. I would love to hear yours. Everybody has an elder, an auntie, an uncle, a granny, a grandfather, someone in their community who shared those proverbs, and they were trying to tell us things about leadership. So I'd really love to invite you to do that as I carry on now. So the first one that I'm going to share with you is this one, because this is one I heard a lot in my house. And I'm going to probably butcher it now, just for the sake of understanding. But what it is it says, if you can't dance a yard, you can't dance abroad. Now, loosely translated, what that means is if you can't dance, your yard is your house, in your own house, how on earth are you going to be able to dance if you go somewhere else? Now, again, what that means is it's really important to know yourself before you can move in other spaces. That is the starting point for me in terms of leadership. Who are you? And many of us are having to grapple with what's been the Jedi mind trick of assimilation. We've been talking about that earlier on, that we have to be like someone else in order to get on. Actually, what we need to do is know ourselves. And for me, I don't know if you remember this, but this is when you came to do the talk for Diversifying Leadership. And this is one of the things that you said that was so powerful. The best thing anyone can wish you is the joy of knowing yourself, because your values, how you understand your identity, how you tell your story comes from you. And I know, Anthony, you were also talking about speaking someone else's language. You know, that really resonates with me, that anything that I do around leadership development is informed by those stories, that cultural memory from the ancestors, from my parents, from my community, that I carry with me, as well as my experiences of someone who's grown up in this country. So this young lady at the front here, Dina Asher-Smith, Eat Your Heart Out, didn't really know herself, has had to spend a lifetime to get to know herself and to get to understand that people would be happy with her winning the 100 meters, but maybe not so happy putting on a white coat and being a scientist, and what that might mean. How was this young woman going to be able to navigate that? And it takes a long time for many of us who have been to school in this country. And I'm mindful of the conversation that happened earlier on about people who had been to school elsewhere. I think, Winston, you raised this, and how, you know, in some ways you've been a bit more fortified, and in terms of, you know, that sort of self-confidence, I guess. I certainly have seen some of that on the programs I've delivered with international academics who have been born and raised where they are in the majority, let's face it, and they don't know that they're BAME until they come to this country and somebody tells them. So it's a very different space to be in, where all the people in positions of authority don't look like you. And I went through my entire school system. I think there was one teacher who looked like me. And again, through all of my higher education with that as well. So really important to think about knowing who you are and what that means in terms of your values. And I want you to invite you to be thinking about what your values are now, because what tends to happen in higher education and other benevolent institutions is the values seem to be similar: fairness, egalitarianism, social justice. So if those values are consistent, then what is going wrong? What does that mean? And what does that mean for you as leaders when you're in that space? Why would you want to be in that space? What is the difference that you're going to bring? So that's proverb number 1. I'm going to go on to proverb number 2. This is something I heard a lot in my house. Show me your company and I'll tell you who you are. And for this one, again, that was usually stay away from that crowd, but hang out in this crowd. So again, in terms of a leadership context, this really speaks to the conversation that we've been having about networks and sponsors. And again, for those of you who are ambitious and want to move on in terms of formal positions, and I do agree that position power is not the only type of power that you have, but if positionality is important for you, then the career enablers that you marshal around you are important. And they will include sponsors and mentors and coaches and a whole board of people that you have to have around you. So your job is to be strategic about that and do a forensic analysis of your networks to establish whether they are just your personal networks or your professional networks, the people who help you do your day job, or are they people who are going to take you into that stretch zone so that you can get to that next level? And part of that will be the importance of networks of people like this one, people who look like you, but also being in those networks of people who don't look like you. And, you know, I talked about thinking like a reviewer. If you're never in the space where you get to understand how a reviewer thinks, and most of those reviewers are white, then it's going to be really, really difficult to do that. So again, I would encourage you all to really be strategic about your networks. Who are the 3 most important people now in terms of your networks? And who are the 3 most important people in terms of their networks? And I know a lot of people, again, don't see networking as a legitimate part of what they're doing, very invested in your academic identity. That takes up enough of your time, thank you very much, but really, really important part of what you do. So you need to factor in the time and energy to do this in a sustainable way. And you've already heard from Annette how that's paid dividends in terms of people who have come back and have actually wanted to support and advocate for her. So I'm not going to say too much about sponsorship, but I will just pick up on some of the earlier conversations about sponsorship and mentorship. And the important thing for me is about that alignment. So what you want is a sponsor mindset and a sponsee mindset so that you have congruence, you have that joint enterprise. It is a quid pro quo relationship where if a sponsor is extending their networks to you, of course they're going to be looking for something in return. But that doesn't mean that it can't be something that is in alignment and it will work for both parties. But those people who sign checks, have budgets and resources are for the most part not going to look like you. So they will be white sponsors. And I am someone who has had sponsors, again, of all descriptions, sometimes didn't recognize that they were sponsors, because it's only when we're talking about, you know, African and global majority groups that we talk about sponsorship. But sponsorship happens all the time. We just don't call it that when we're talking about white males perhaps sponsoring white males. It happens all the time. So really important to tap into people who are in those positions of power, and how you get on that radar is indeed in the ways that some people have spoken about: putting yourself forward strategically, working collaboratively with others so that you can get onto, whether it's networks or whether it is on joint projects that you can work with people. But what you want to do is get on their radar. It may even be following them if they've got the same research interests as you, if they have got the same social justice interests as you. A simple like on their social media may get you on their radar. So if, again, you are struggling with networking, if you are an introvert, or indeed because most of us are working from home, that's a challenge for you, I really want to encourage you to tap into spaces like this more so that you can build your confidence around networking. And the final thing that I'd say about this as well is that, you know, Gus has put in a shift. 60 years is a long time, and I know, Gus, that, you know, you'll be doing this, you know, forever. but it is also incumbent upon us to build a critical mass of people, Gus's all over the place, and for us to be our own Gus, to do it in our own way. Not everybody is going to hit you over the head in the way that Gus does, and I love you for it, Gus, but it's also to be able to do it in your own authentic way. So we need a critical mass of people who can do this work, but also we can leverage the influence that we've got to make sure that those people in positions of power also do what they need to do. So the last proverb is this one, "Dop know if you're frightened." And again, I'm sure there are some people in this space who know that what that means. A duppy is a ghost, so it means a ghost knows who to frighten. So we've heard a lot of things today about you know, the challenges and how to navigate spaces. I'm going to land here. This is you can't see who this is, but this is actually my dad. I talk a lot about my mum, but this is my dad. My dad had a tough time in this country. He was one of those people that had a really tough time. Ooh. I've just lost my screen. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can see the screen too.
Oh, right. OK, it's just disappeared from me. I'm going to carry on because I know what's on there. What he's doing there is he's in Jamaica. He's in Spanish Town, Jamaica, if you're in Jamaica, and he's protesting. That's a sandwich board that he's got on. My dad's 86 years old. He was in the middle of the street walking up and down with his sandwich board because he wanted justice for effectively this kind of phone provider. And the key thing that I'm saying there is whatever you do next in your leadership journey, people are going to come at you as you change, as you grow, as you start to build your networks, as you become more agentic. People are not going to like that. So you need to sit in the driver's seat and remain there and go for what you want. Know what you want, which is what we heard earlier. And part of that is going to be doing your due diligence on all of those people in positions of power, your due diligence around funding, as we heard from Io, so that you can step into the stretch goal and give yourself the best possible chance. And so the last thing that I want to say is be authentic in your activism, find your own way of doing it, because that enables you to be the authentic leader that you aspire to be. Now, I don't know if you can see any more of my slides now, but I'm just going to end by saying, you know, we need more leaders like you who bring your leadership already. You're already leaders in terms of what you're doing in your communities. You're already in your faith communities. You're already supporting community groups, perhaps supplementary schools, perhaps counsellors, on boards. You already have many of those leadership skills. Leverage them, utilise them, connect with each other and bring the difference that is needed in higher education. So I'm going to stop there and thank you. And just I'm not sure if there was anything in the chat because I couldn't see it. So I'm just going to unshare and then you can let me know, Marcia, if there's anything in the chat.
There's lots in the chat, Janet. And you know what? As far as I'm concerned, you are a doctor. You're the doctor of leadership. That was absolutely brilliant.